Hello everyone, I'm Michael, and today, I'm going to tell you a story. Autopsy doctors of Reddit. What was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? Story 1. Worked at an animal hospital. They did necropsies for zoos all the time. An alligator died, and they shipped it to the hospital, refrigerated, etc. to stop the decay. They took it out and put it up on the table. After doing all the paperwork, they started opening up the alligator. After the first cut, the alligator opened its eyes. Turns out it wasn't dead. The zoo vet mistook an illness for death, and the low temperature put it basically into a coma. Story 2. I worked at a coroner's office for a while, and once we had a guy who we thought had died from an odd on meth. Well, we started the autopsy and I went to cut his lungs out and blueberry muffin mix started coming out of them. I stuck my finger in his mouth and it was full of blueberry muffin mix. And it was in throat. Turns out he got just high enough to pass out while eating the muffin mix and he ended up choking to death. Story 3. 6 months after my aunt's passing in a drunk driving incident, the coroner decided to ring up my mom and inform her that they completed their report on her passing and deemed the likelihood of suicidal intentions which may have factored into said incident. I initially didn't understand how coroners could deduce such a thing. Until I remembered self-harm scars are a thing. My mom had only just gotten to the acceptance stage of grief, and it put her firmly back to square one. She's fine now. Story 4. So, I'm not an autopsy doctor or anything of the sort. I did sit in on a murder trial. The mom drowned her infant in hot water. She claimed she was giving her newborn a bath in the sink with one of those sling-type inserts so babies can't go under. The doorbell rang. She answered and came back to her kid in scalding hot water. She claimed the kid had somehow turned on the hot water and burned himself while she was answering the door, but drowning was the ultimate rule of death. In the autopsy photos, the most disturbing thing I've ever seen in real life is you could clearly make out hand marks on that poor child's skin on his biceps. You could see the finger outlines like you do if someone slaps you. I was 18 years old taking a criminal justice class. Just the ease of watching the trail and her nonchalance killed most faith I had in humanity at the time. I know this doesn't quite fit the question, but for years, I saw that boy's face in my sleep. What really kills me is despite evidence she got off. Story 5. I did the autopsy of both the robber and his victim. The robber shot the victim in the back when he tried to escape in a motorcycle, and the robber was shot by the police in the exact same situation. What's interesting is that they both died by exactly the same lesion. Both of them had their fourth lumbar vertebra shattered and their aorta, main artery of the body, sectioned at the same level. I thought of it like an extreme example of instant karma. Story 6. During my internship rotation a couple of years back, a 40-year-old guy came in because he suddenly collapsed while drinking with friends. He came in unresponsive, mouth bleeding, and not breathing, so we had to intubate him. For some reason, the endotracheal tube, the stiff tube placed inside the trachea to help the patient breathe, won't go in, but we managed to suction copious amounts of blood clots. After CPR, still with unsuccessful intubation, so we had to bag him with a face mask. The patient was declared dead and diagnosed with a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. During the autopsy, they found out that the guy was apparently shot by a gun from the top of the head. The entry wound was obscured by his hair and was barely bleeding at all, and the bullet somehow went through the back of the guy's throat and made a hole behind the base of the tongue, which the endotracheal tube kept slipping into. Story 7. During medical school, I did a forensic pathology rotation during 4th year. Had an autopsy on a woman found in her burned-out home. She was on home oxygen, and the fire started in her bedroom. There were also liquor bottles around the home, so the thought was maybe she was drunk, smoking in bed, and caught herself on fire. She was badly charred up on the outside, with no real distinguishing characteristics I could see. We opened her up, and when we got to her lungs, they were just the prettiest pink you could imagine. Just like in the textbooks. This means she wasn't alive to breathe in the smoke and sit from the fire, so she had died. Spoiler, was murdered before it was set. Ultimately, I read in the paper some weeks later, it was the boyfriend trying to get insurance money. Story 8. Training in the medical examiner's office. Elderly woman found dead by herself in her home. There was nothing suspicious, so I was given the case. Took out all the organs, dissected everything, completely unremarkable. I cut through the larynx as the last step before I could clean up and finish the case, and boom, giant piece of chicken lodged in her windpipe. Died choking on dinner. Story 9. I was an investigator for a state medical examiner for just over 2 years. Had a mom that had drank herself to death, according to the husband, after relapsing on Mother's Day weekend. I just felt like something was off. Sent her for an autopsy. Had a ruptured liver where dude had essentially beat her till she internally bled to death. Later, while out on bail, he stole a semi-truck, crashed it in a pond, got out shooting at a deputy, and they killed him. Saved the taxpayers a good chunk of money. Story 10. Former homicide detective here. Suspicious death. 30-ish male found alone by cleaning staff in the back row of a sparsely attended sci-fi movie. Strange scratching wounds around in mouth. Some petechiae in eyes and on cheeks, but no signs of strangulation. No obvious signs of chronic illness or disease. Presented as healthy, normal adult male. Found on his person was a wallet with normal contents and a single canceled movie ticket, indicating he went alone. Weird, spy movie shit going on here. Autopsy. A large amount of popcorn compacted in his esophagus. Like a half cup. Dude was apparently excited by the movie, stuffing popcorn in his mouth, and choked. The scratch marks around in his mouth were self-inflicted, trying to dig out popcorn, verified via fingernail scrapings. His was only DNA present. Loud movie. He was in the back. No one saw or heard him choke. I've never eaten popcorn again. Story 11. Med student almost graduated here. A couple years ago, I attended the pathological anatomy course, and during a class, the professor showed us some autopsies. Despite the tremendous smell of 4/5 consecutive autopsies, one of them was carried out on a homeless patient that died in the ER, probably due to heart failure. The body had massive ascites, flared in the abdomen, so at first, he had to evacuate it. Imagine him cutting the abdomen, and the yellow rancid liquid started to come out like a fountain. One of my colleagues fainted. Then the next step was to examine the abdominal organs. Imagine the face of every person in the room when it became clear that the patient had some form of inherited polycystic disease, and the liver and the kidneys are full of cysts. The liver weighed more than 10 kilograms. Normal weight 2 to 3 kilograms, and the kidneys almost 3 kilograms each, normally 150 grams each. The professor was really shocked at the beginning, but then he really enjoyed cutting through the cysts in order to get samples. They popped like airballs, spreading liquid all over the place. Second colleague fainted. The other ones were pretty standard, but I think I will remember forever this one, in particular that liver on the scale. I even took a picture, but I can't find it anymore. Story 12. Not a doctor, but a whole body scientific donation technician. I'm the person who dissects cadavers after they were donated. We very commonly would get young cases, normally overdoses. Had a mid-30s female, went to medical examiner prior to donation, but they only did an external evaluation. I went to check her genitals to see if I could palpate a uterus, found a condom full of pills. Similar to most, the body became a crime scene and we couldn't touch her. When we finally were able to continue, they asked us to photograph the pills to send to the examiner's office. They were mostly Advil and Zyrtec, easily one of the weirdest things I've ever found. Story 13. Working in the ER. Young man comes in, one of 4 in a nasty auto accident. Speed pollution experience equals car flipped. Passengers ejected. One expired shortly after coming into the ER. I transported the body down to the morgue. First time I had felt a human being with all their bones broken. Felt like trying to lift sheets full of rolling bowling balls. Once in the morgue, I commented how unscathed he looked. He really did. Some dirt. The tube. Not much else. Me offered I could view the autopsy if interested. I was interested. The first thing they noted were the x-rays of the fractures. Basically, all the major bones, including multiple rib fractures. When they opened the body, the organs were described as near liquefied. It wasn't until weeks later I got the whole story from the EMT who had been on scene. Seems the passenger had been one half in, one half out the window while the car had been flipping. He was just days shy of 17. The driver was just days past 16. His parents had bought him a brand new car. He'd had it less than 72 hours. Driver lived, though with severe brain damage. Front and rear passengers died. Rear driver's side passenger survived with not too much permanent physical damage. I have friends whose kids are getting their driver's license. I never pass up a chance to drop that story on them. I've seen a lot of effed up things in my healthcare career. That is one of the grand total of 3 that make me tear up, and it's one from early on. Story 14. This story circulates every year at my medical school. A body came in with a gunshot wound to the chest. There was no exit wound. They tried to locate the bullet during the autopsy. No success. They then did a whole scan, X-ray or cord, of the upper chest, abdomen, pelvis. No bullet. At that point someone said, "Fuck it, let's scan the whole body." Lo and behold, the bullet was detected in the popliteal fossa, area behind the knee. It had embolus traveled from the heart all the way down the arterial system to the knee, where it had stuck in one of the narrower blood vessels. Story 15. Forensic pathologist here. To come to mind, I had just moved back to my home state where family lives. Get a case with a man with a distinctive last name in the family tree. I put a text out to my mom to see if we were related, but before she texted back, I pulled the sheet back and already knew he looked like me. It was my great uncle. Get a case where it's a house fire death. On exam, he's got multiple textbook stab and incised wounds. I spend the next 30 minutes getting gaslighted, quizzed by PD about "Are you sure?" because they thought this was a straightforward house fire. Unfun fact, fire's not an uncommon way for people to try to conceal a homicide. Story 16. My wife is a pathologist assistant and during her schooling carried out the autopsy of a newborn that died minutes after birth. The mother was desperate for a child and had a history of multiple miscarriages at different terms. This was her first time making it full term, and all prenatal checkups revealed no problems. The delivery was difficult, but successful, and baby was alive for a short time. Skip to autopsy. All signs point to baby being fully developed. Get to the abdominal cavity, and the liver is lacerated and hemorrhage everywhere. During the difficult delivery, the resident used too much force with the forceps to pull the baby out. The ruptured liver that caused the baby to bleed out internally. Wife was enthusiastic about autopsy up to this point, now has no interest. Story 17. Sheep farmer. I have to know how to do a necropsy for when something dies to know if it's something that could spread. Had a ewe fall over dead after losing a ton of weight and after treating her for everything under the sun. She would gasp for air and struggle to breathe, but antibiotics, steroids, and anti-inflammatory drugs didn't touch it. She finally passed away and I cut her open to see what the hell happened, fully expecting to see her lungs riddled with shit. Her heart was 5 times the normal size and hard as a river stone. My guess is she'd had that issue her whole life and it didn't kill her until she was 2. Story 18. I was in charge of making copies of all evidence to be used in the trial of Donald Harvey in 1989. He was known as the Angel of Death. One bit of evidence was an autopsy photo of an exhumed elderly woman. The examiner was holding with tweezers an 18-piece of cotton being pulled from her throat. Harvey liked to stuff cotton so far down into the victim's throats that it could not be seen. I still can't shake the image from my brain. Story 19. Masters in forensic pathology here. You'd be surprised to know the number of people that have life-threatening issues that never went diagnosed, and that they didn't die from. Seen an older guy who died of pneumonia in hospital. On autopsy, the guy had both an enlarged heart and a couple of medium-sized aneurysms in the brain. Another guy in his 70s apparently came into the ER and had chest pain, then died shortly after. Dies of a heart attack, but also had cancer. In less natural circumstances, though, saw a guy who had been shot in the head a couple of times. 3 definite entries and a blown-out skull, but police only found 1 bullet. Couldn't find the other bullet in his head at all. Assumed the police missed it. Went on as normal with the autopsy, until we got to the chest cavity. The other bullet was just chilling beside his lung. Turns out it entered the skull, hit the inside, ricocheted down his neck and into the chest. That was pretty wild. Story 20. I may be late to the party, but I finally have a good story to tell. In medical school, my group's cadaver was an 80-plus-year-old female who was extremely unfit, morbidly obese with muscles half the size of any other cadavers. Her pectoral muscles were paper-thin. To get some reference, we figured she was bedridden during her last few months, which would somewhat explain these findings. When we started our neurology unit and began to dissect the infratemporal fossa, I discovered a small metal pellet under the skin behind her right here. My tank mates and I went on to find dozens of these metal pellets strewn around. her head's anatomy, with some lodged into the cranium and others in the bones of her face. We contacted her living relatives to get some clarification, and they ended up revealing that when this lady and her brother were children, they said she was 8 years old. They were playing with an old decorative rifle that the family had mounted above the fireplace. Long story short, the brother accidentally discharged the rifle into the girl's face. The aftermath was this lady was blind and wheelchair-bound for the rest of her life, and the pellets weren't all removed. It was an interesting dissection with that information from then on, but a sobering moment in reminding our class that our cadavers are humans with their own struggles and rich lives. If you're considering donating your body to science, please know that we don't take the responsibility lightly, and a million thanks aren't enough. I have more stories if anyone is curious. Story 21. Not mine, but a doctor I used to work with. Back when he was in school, he would do his cadaver labs really late at night, many people during the day. One time, it was really late, around 2 a.m. He was listening to his lecture on his headphones and he saw the cadaver's arm move twitch. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he saw it again, proceeded to run away in a panic. He told a few of his classmates what happened, but nobody believed him. Next day, they had a group cadaver lab with the same cadaver. The arm twitched yet again. The professor did some digging, and it turns out the patient's pacemaker was still fully functional and occasionally fired, causing the arm twitch. He was so relieved. He thought there was a zombie in there. Story 22. My dad used to perform autopsies. His best story was that they were brought a body that has no real indication of any issues. After examining the body, the only thing of note was that there was blood coming out of the guy's rectum. They begin the autopsy and the guy's organs are completely liquefied and the body cavity is filled with lead shot. It became apparent really quickly that someone had shoved a shotgun up his ass and pulled the trigger. This was in the 70s, and I still have to wonder what this guy did to piss someone off enough to get a shotgun up his ass. Story 23. Not exactly an autopsy per se, but it was a patient found unresponsive, with CPR in progress by AMS. The man was clearly homeless, based on his appearance and smell. He reportedly had not been seen for several days by his friends, and was eventually found behind a fast food restaurant dumpster. We were briefly able to get a pulse back, and when the nurse cut his pants off to place a catheter, we saw the cause. He had fashioned some sort of makeshift cock ring out of the neck of a plastic bottle. It was way too tight and completely cut off the circulation. The penis was fully black and necrotic. I did a bedside ultrasound and found his abdomen full of free fluid, which is bad. Most likely his bladder had ruptured from being unable to urinate for days. His lab suggested he was in septic shock and full-blown renal failure as well. He did not survive much longer than that. Story 24. Medical student here, and this story is from anatomy class. One of the cadavers in our class died of cancer, and when we took out the gentleman's liver, it was very large and full of bumps all over. The liver itself was also hard as a rock. The poor man's cancer had spread all over his liver and was full of tumors. It really hit home that this was what cancer was like and demonstrated its pure destructive nature. Story 25. Medical examiner here. This probably isn't a big wow revelation, but it certainly made an impact on me. Very early in my career, I did an exam on another doctor who worked at the hospital where I trained. I didn't know this gentleman personally, but was acquainted with him by reputation. He was a very happy-go-lucky sort, much loved by everyone in his department. He died unexpectedly at a young age of what turned out to be a drug overdose on pharmaceuticals. He had been diverting from the hospital. I don't think anybody saw that coming, myself included. It was a lesson to me that anybody can fall victim to addiction, and that it's hard to know what anybody's private struggles are. Story 26. I am not a pathologist, but when my father died from drowning, it was noted he had acute cirrhosis of the liver. The coroner also removed a bullet from between his heart and spine that Dad received in Vietnam. It was very degraded. He had also lost a thumb and several feet of intestine there, the evidence of which was noted in the report. Dad had served 22 years in the Army and had been awarded the Purple Heart 3 times. He lived a hard life after, and it was speculated he would have passed soon of cirrhosis of the liver had he not drowned.